In a state of both embarrassment and mild inebriation, the young lady confessed her love to a suitor, a tall, dark-haired gentleman. He, eager to understand the root of her affections, queried her, and she expressed her sentiments with ease, even entertaining the notion that her affection might be unrequited. Suddenly, a prospective duke standing before her embraced the young lady. However, in that instant, she realized that the man who now held her differed markedly from the individual she had originally intended to disclose her love to, not only in stature but even in the color of his hair. Inebriated, the protagonist confused two entirely dissimilar men, committing a monumental error. Presently, she found herself in the arms of the cavernous Willard, poised to inherit one of the most influential duchies in the empire, and also holding the rank of the commander of the Nickel Knights. The majority of commoners harbored fear of him, and he was even bestowed with the moniker, the Crimson Reaper. Right at this moment, the protagonist erroneously confessed her affection to him, realizing the dire consequences of such a misstep. This girl had been reborn into this world after her demise, encountering two men who were polar opposites of each other. While Cavert was perpetually stern, aloof, and instilled fear not only on the battlefield, but also among those in his proximity, Elvin Eris Camir, who was dubbed the Empire's Light, was conversely kind and exceedingly handsome, the object of the young lady's affection. Evidently owing to the blunder committed, the ducal heir would be exceedingly incensed, posing even a threat to the young lady's life. She contemplated the most polite means of seeking forgiveness and clarifying that her avowal was actually intended for a different individual. When an unexpected turn of events transpired, Cavert addressed Renée, who still stood bewildered before him, and requested an informal discourse, thereby conveying the mutuality of her affections. Moreover, his countenance underwent an unexpected transformation. Hitherto, the youth had never smiled. He had perpetually appeared rather serious. This facet of his demeanor had undeniably been disconcerting, but now he seemed to exude an air of felicity. The young lady could no longer truthfully reveal her sentiments to this man, as doing so would peril her life. The weather was overcast, and the main character, a temple servant, was tasked with collecting the linens that were drying outside. Given the impending rain, a regular client who frequented the holy place for the services of healers would likely visit. It was thanks to this man that the temple could subsist and accrue the necessary funds for its requirements. The young lady's friend attempted to console her before the arrival of this significant guest. Nevertheless, it offered her no solace, for working with Cabot was fraught with danger, as any mistake during their collaboration could easily result in the loss of life. Having already experienced death once on her way home, she had no desire to relive that experience. Renée's story was a rather commonplace one, involving a girl who, in the throes of death, was transported into the body of a novel's character or another world. However, her journey proved more arduous than most. After succumbing to death on her way home, the protagonist lingered in the library for an inordinate amount of time to fulfill an academic task. Subsequently, she became the victim of an accident and awoke in an unfamiliar place, inhabiting the body of an orphan. After 4 days, Renée found herself on the brink of death once more, and she could only hope to find respite after this harrowing reincarnation. Alas, respite was not destined for her, for the main character awoke some time later in an entirely unfamiliar locale. It was a temple, and she was enlightened about how a priest by the name of Demetrio had aided her survival. Furthermore, she was offered sanctuary within the temple, should she have nowhere else to turn, a proposition she readily accepted. With time, the protagonist came to realize that in this world, divinity indeed existed, and certain clergy possessed the power of the divine, capable of healing the place she had arrived in. At that point, Elnir was the haven for underprivileged orphans, a location endowed with limited resources, but one where the children were free from concerns about sustenance. As the young lady reached adulthood, she was presented with two choices: to remain in service at the temple she had grown up in, or to venture beyond its confines to construct her own life. Despite her conviction that she could readily earn a living independently, she chose not to depart. When Renée touched the sphere that was meant to gauge her divine energy, it registered something extraordinary. She discovered that she possessed immense power unmatched by anyone in her temple. Hence, it would have been wiser for her to depart the place. Nevertheless, that option was no longer available to her. This, in turn, brought considerable prosperity to the temple, as she welcomed both notable and less prominent visitors in concert with the high priest. A high priest appeared beside her, compelling her to accompany him to his office to discuss a forthcoming task that he intended to assign her. However, his demeanor was more peculiar than usual, for he even pledged not to coerce the central heroine into carrying out the mission this time. As it turned out, the neighboring kingdom of Vios, situated next to the empire in which the young lady resided, had chosen to declare war. Despite the unequal distribution of strength and the dismal economic state of the small nation, they had managed to capture a small territory owing to its inadequate defense. Although their enemy was exceedingly feeble, the capital decided to dispatch two of the most formidable knightly contingents, commanded by Elvin Araz and Kavart, to combat the threat. Utilizing this incursion as a pretext, the imperial ruler opted to annex the kingdom that had instigated the attack. Consequently, the temples were compelled to dispatch their healers to tend to the warriors injured on the battlefield. Hence, the high priest apprised the central heroine of these circumstances, hoping she would consent to embark on such an unusual and perilous mission. Yet the young lady had completely different intentions. She held her life in high regard, and therefore categorically refused. Of course, the man attempted to persuade Renee to reconsider her stance, as many regarded this war as safe. In her previous life, the young lady had always been diligent in her pursuits, which is why she now aspired to take a respite from them. However, despite her lack of enthusiasm for any particular endeavor, she had been endowed with prodigious divine power, compelling her to execute specific assignments. At present, regardless of the high priest's continued entreaties, she had no intention of agreeing to employ her abilities to aid those who might meet their demise on the battlefield at any moment. Seemingly, nothing could have swayed her reconsideration. Yet when it emerged that the remuneration for this mission was extraordinarily substantial, her perspective underwent a precipitous transformation. At that point, the healer rationalized this unexpected shift in her stance, asserting her readiness to embark on this mission for a noble cause, and she consented to undertake it. Even though she would not be able to retain all the money for herself, it still amounted to a substantial sum. Finances have always served as a more potent motivator for individuals than anything else. So even though the central heroine yearned for a carefree life, these funds would never go amiss. Now Renee was compelled to return to her daily duties, as a vital client from the temple would soon arrive. It was imperative not to forget this. These thoughts once again filled the young lady with trepidation, for any mistake in her work could potentially lead to her execution by the Duke. Upon meeting Lily in the chamber, the central protagonist resolved to engage her in a discourse regarding the impending war. To her astonishment, she learned that her friend Lily was also planning to partake in the conflict. In truth, not every clergyman possessed the ability to mend others through their intrinsic power. Those who sought to serve the deity were screened using the crystal sphere, and only a select few could attain the role of a healer. Furthermore, within the empire, an organization of individuals endowed with such aptitudes, known as the Gloria, existed. To be admitted, there meant an official designation as the healer of the nation. Lily aspired fervently to join its ranks, and even pondered whether participation in the war would bolster her resume. For this esteemed community, there was scant time remaining until the arrival of the temple's distinguished guest. The central heroine discerned her tardiness, and it filled her with trepidation. In the temple where Renee served, the emergence of her divine power had undeniably led to an influx of visitors. Albeit most individuals still favored the state church, they could attract a substantial clientele with their modest pricing, yet this practice undermined the stability of their temple. However, several years ago, Elnir began to garner significantly more revenue due to the frequent visits of a wealthy duke. At this moment, the central heroine hastened to meet her client, but she was cognizant that her tardiness was considerable, which greatly perturbed her. As she arrived at the entrance of the temple, the high priest was already in conversation with the guests. This individual had partaken in battles for many years and consistently emerged victorious. His sword incessantly dripped with the blood of his adversaries on the battlefield, earning him the epithet Blood Reaper. Merely gazing upon the Duke evoked a sense of horror. Thus, Renesha did not immediately summon the courage to approach him, as she feared the reprisal that could result from her recognition. It was revealed that this stern man would often visit the temple solely to seek repose. The resting chamber for the esteemed guest was situated at the very end of the corridor, where the central heroine led him. Once again, commander of the Nickel Knights, Cavert was renowned as one of the preeminent swordmasters in the entire empire. However, few were privy to the fact that this man was exceptionally sensitive to sounds. The days leading up to the departure to the theater of warfare passed swiftly for our main protagonist. Renee found herself gripped by fear, unwilling to witness the specter of death, or worse yet, to meet her own demise on the battlefield. Furthermore, her fellow temple servants teased her mercilessly upon learning of her chosen destination, taunting her with thoughtless jests. The empire in which our main character resided was renowned as a haven of peace. Despite the perpetual wars that raged beyond its borders, Elvinoras and Kavar in particular frequently engaged in battle, achieving resounding victories and bringing countless accolades to their homeland. However, the people's perception of them was markedly disparate. The paladin commander received high praise, whereas those who followed the banners of the Nickel Knights held an intense threat of their leader. Partially, this discrepancy in attitudes arose from the gruesome murders of the Duke's heir and his brother, who were found slain under inexplicable circumstances. This brutality shocked the Empire's populace, yet investigations were never carried out. Rumors persisted that rain brought forth a flow of blood from the decorative swords within Cavert's estate. Although belief in such tales seemed ludicrous, the man continued to visit the temple during rainstorms. Sitting within the carriage alongside her friend, the healer found herself perplexed by Lily's unwavering composure in the face of impending war. It appeared far more likely that conflict would ensue among the commanding officers rather than in confrontation with the common enemy. As the entourage neared the gathering place for warriors and healers on the outskirts of the capital city, the troops were already assembled, including the state church's healers, indicating the belatedness of the two girls. Nonetheless, no overt reproach was directed their way, signifying that their tardiness would not result in condemnation. Lily promptly directed her attention to the commander of the paladins, who stood in close proximity, deeming it necessary to inform him of the arrival of the girls from a humble temple. This man possessed a striking countenance, boasting golden locks that bore the insignia of the royal lineage. To Renee, Elvinurus appeared as the most beautiful soul she had encountered in this realm, rivaling only the Duke in terms of strength, a stark contrast to the latter's character. The enchanting warrior warmly greeted the arriving girls, having heard of the main character's reputation as the most powerful healer in her temple. Enchanted by the encounter with the paladin commander, Renee began to exhibit somewhat peculiar behavior, prompting her friend to gently nudge her in an effort to restore her composure, bestowing upon her a radiant smile. This unexpected reaction from one of the Empire's celebrated heroes brought a sense of relief to the girl. The young man proceeded to describe the plan of action to the two healers. It was essential to reach the borders and fortify their positions before launching any offensive into enemy-held territories. The conversation triggered a sudden realization within our protagonist, who became acutely aware of the peril faced by those around her, particularly if she were to make an error in her healing endeavors. Despite appearances, the rest of the participants seemed remarkably composed, in stark contrast to Renee, who appeared distinctly fearful. Nevertheless, the commander assured her that his unit would defend the temple servants at all costs. In that moment, Renee resolved to draw closer to the more amiable of the two heroes, thereby increasing her chances of survival. As the group set forth on their journey, the young lady attempted to soothe her apprehensions, briefly entertaining the notion that the journey might yet prove enjoyable. However, mere hours into the venture, she recognized the path as a grueling one. Their route led them through mountainous terrain with several peaks to conquer. Progress became increasingly arduous, and the yearning for home crept into her thoughts. During a respite in their tent, the main character observed the state church's healers, who seemed hardier and more enduring. Renee gazed into the distance at the mountains she would soon ascend and grappled with the daunting prospect that lay before her. At that moment, the returning warriors abruptly required the aid of the healers. As the number of wounded exceeded expectations, it emerged that the squad led by the paladin commander had been ambushed by the enemy, signifying that the Nickel Knights had managed to elude their adversaries and likely returned with promising tidings. The head of the state church's priests expressed an intention to assist the gravely wounded soldier. However, Elvener has issued a directive for Renee to undertake this task. While the young lady might have preferred to remain uninvolved, another healer genuinely desired to save the injured soldier. Nevertheless, the man's decision remained resolute. This choice puzzled all those present, as the girl possessed significantly less experience in the art of healing. Without delving into protracted explanations, the Empire's hero merely stated that this course of action would prove most efficacious. Despite the discontent of those around her, the main protagonist refrained from challenging the decision and executed her assigned duties with commendable proficiency. Once the wounded soldier had been made whole again, he approached the one who had saved him to express his gratitude. However, this development clearly irked the representatives of the state church, who glared indignantly as the words of appreciation typically addressed to them now found another recipient. While Renee had no intention of engaging in conflict, her fellow healers remained unsatisfied with the turn of events and thus began seeking retribution. During a meager meal consisting solely of soup and bread, her bread loaf was seized by disgruntled priests who justified their actions by claiming that their comrade was unwell, and sharing food with him was the right course of action. Such events recurred for several consecutive days, and the young lady, for the most part, accepted her fate. However, Lily's displeasure mounted as she witnessed her friend being treated disrespectfully. Despite her lack of wrongdoing, Lily appeared unusually resolute, a departure from her typical composure and adherence to propriety. She approached the table of the state church's servants to put an end to the ridicule they subjected her friend to. She admonished the miscreants, asserting that compelling someone to sacrifice their sustenance for others was unacceptable as it violated a fundamental principle in any divine doctrine. In doing so, she not only depicted these individuals as impolite, but also as unlettered, given their ignorance of the fundamental tenets they had been serving for years. Hence, their actions no longer appeared as morally sound and seemed more akin to illicit plunder. With a smile, Lily retrieved the food that belonged to her friend and departed, leaving the now even more disgruntled healers without the opportunity for self-affirmation at Renee's expense. The main character viewed her friend from a new perspective, thereby deciding not to engage in any actions that could provoke her ire. After the recent surge in wounded soldiers, the state church's priests found themselves overwhelmed, their strength insufficient for the growing demands. Despite Renee's superior healing gifts, fatigue weighed on her just as heavily as on her colleagues. Working tirelessly until late into the night, she finally made her way to her tent, yearning for rest and sleep. Soldiers returning from the battlefield sought her assistance eagerly, challenging her ability to keep up with the escalating wounded count. Despite the challenging battle days, the Duke, much like the second hero of the Empire, emerged unscathed and composed. Following a strenuous day's labor, Renee sighed with relief, anticipating the upcoming respite. Her solitude, however, proved fleeting, as a warrior discovered her in a secluded outdoor spot where she sought solace. Gardiel, a jovial young man, materialized to express gratitude for her help in treating his arm injury. Despite the demand on her skills, Renee's healing efforts did not go unnoticed by those she aided. Thanks to the young lady's efforts, Gardiel experienced a remarkably swift recovery, although a scar on his shoulder served as a testament to the profound nature of his injury. Despite the challenges of battlefield life, the luxury of prioritizing personal survival over others was unattainable, as deserting would condemn others in his place. This rationale guided those who ventured to the front lines. Recognizing this, the main character regretted allowing her fears to prioritize individual survival over collective well-being. Gardiel emphasized that his courage was reinforced by the Paladin commander's prowess in defeating adversaries, making it safe to follow such a leader. Injecting humor into the conversation, Gardiel alluded to mentions Elvin Oraz had made about her, revealing that the commander had pointed out her location. From the warrior, she also learned that she had been bestowed the title of God's Envoy by the captain of the Paladins. Despite the grandiose designation, Renee felt uneasy about the title, and only in solitude did she contemplate the significance of being pronounced God's Envoy by one of the Empire's two heroes. She yearned for an opportunity to be closer to him, even if just once. But such a chance was not easily attainable. If the Paladin commander were to sustain an injury, she could then realize her wish. In reality, the healer had no desire for any harm to befall Elvin Oraz, so she swiftly brushed aside these disquieting thoughts. While it was highly improbable that any of their adversaries could rival this man's strength, she still grappled with guilt over her inner musings. In any case, it was time for the young woman to return to the duties she had been tending to for hours, casting aside the awkward thoughts. However, soon the camp became frenetic with preparations as a reconnaissance group returned from a mission, this time with only 2 casualties. For Renee, this mission held a unique aspect. As soon as Elvin Oraz returned, he summoned the young lady to his tent. When the man turned away, Renee glimpsed bloodstains on his cloak, leading her to conclude that the Empire's hero had been wounded. Now she recollected her yearning to be closer to the Paladin commander and realized that her aspiration could only be realized in the event of his injury. Self-reproach consumed her, for she had never envisioned such a situation. Her divine powers were not meant to work in such a fashion. Before entering the commander's tent, Renee resolved to regain her composure. It appeared his wound was quite serious, given the considerable amount of blood staining his attire. Upon stepping into the hero's quarters, the young lady hoped that her anxiety was unfounded. Yet the sight of a profusion of blood on various pieces of his clothing compelled her to apologize profusely. To the captain of the Paladins, however, she could not lucidly articulate her remorse. With a gentle touch to the healer's hand, he implored her to calm herself. In that moment, Renee found herself regarding this man with awe, for she could not have been more discomposed in such circumstances. Her heart quickened, and in the maelstrom of emotions, it was impossible for her to attain tranquility. Nevertheless, she grappled with her thoughts, realizing how nonsensical her earlier musings had been. The topic could not be left unresolved, and she was prompted to elucidate her initial apology as she reluctantly bared her innermost fears to him. The captain of the Paladin's reaction was nothing short of peculiar. Instead of anger or condemnation for harboring ill intentions, he simply burst into laughter. A few minutes later, he disclosed that he had not been wounded, and the blood on his clothing had stemmed from aiding one of the injured soldiers. It was his observation of the state church's priest's treatment of her that prompted Elvin Oraz to summon her to his tent. He sensed that their conduct was a result of his own actions and felt culpable. They had treated the young lady unjustly and would certainly face a reprimand, which meant that they would likely think twice before taking such actions in the future. In order to conclude the conversation, the young woman prepared to leave, but the man detained her. He recognized that the application of her powers necessitated sincerity, and therefore she did not wish ill upon any of those she intended to heal. The next time Elvin Oraz sustained an injury, he would gladly call upon her for assistance, at which point she could draw closer to him, fulfilling her desire. Finally, this noble man placed a kiss on Renee's hand, which left the bewildered young lady no choice but to hastily depart from the tent. After the recent events, the main heroine found herself unable to sleep. She kept dwelling on Elvin Oras's gesture just before their parting, feeling a sense of embarrassment. Come morning, the knights were to conduct their final reconnaissance before embarking on their journey. The path ahead promised to be challenging, signaling their imminent entry into enemy territory and the quest to seize new lands. Since sleep continued to elude the healer, she decided to take a stroll outside, even though dawn was still a little way off. The sentinels responsible for guarding the camp were peacefully asleep by the campfire, probably exhausted from their duties. Unable to last until morning, she decided not to wake them and therefore attempted to move as quietly as possible. However, she suddenly heard a voice behind her. The speech was both familiar and unsettling, a voice she could recognize under any circumstance. It was none other than the Crimson Reaper himself. The man was inquiring about what the young lady was doing outside her tent at such an early hour, his words carrying a hint of suspicion. Perhaps he suspected that Renesha was a spy, hence her presence on the street at that hour. Even her explanation of her insomnia did not sound very convincing, as healers typically grew exhausted and quickly fell asleep once their work was done. The Duke's heir then changed the subject, revealing that he had noticed Renee's struggles during the mountain crossings, which led him to express concerns about her getting adequate rest. At first, the priestess was quite surprised that Kavar had noticed her limited stamina. Instead of anger or reproach for expressing such fear, he simply laughed. After a few minutes, he explained that her words had not upset him. It appeared that even the imposing man recognized the value of caring for others' well-being and showing empathy for their suffering. His sudden openness surprised the main heroine, and perhaps gave her reason not to fear the heir of the duchy any longer. The priestess was ready to bid farewell to the man, when, by force of habit, she referred to him as a client. She had frequently used that term when discussing Kaver with her friend or the high priest, and her mistake now seemed foolish. In her attempt to correct herself, she referred to him as a duke, which further infuriated him, a sentiment he no longer concealed. Renee's inability to address Kaver correctly and respectfully had unintentionally confirmed rumors suggesting that he was responsible for his brother's death in order to obtain his desired status. The situation was complex and bewildering for the young healer, and her failure to understand proper forms of address had only exacerbated it. Left with no other option, the priestess politely bid her adieu and retreated from the conversation, eager to put an end to this discomforting exchange. Left alone in the midst of the forest not far from the camp, Renee contemplated the events once more and decided that, to avoid any further confusion, she would refer to the man in her thoughts only by his first name. The following morning, Lily attempted to awaken her friend as they were soon to embark on their journey. Unexpectedly, the commander of the paladins approached her, flashing a smile once again and inquiring about her well-being. Though it was quite evident that he was teasing her about last night's incident, she nonetheless surmised that he would be better off not risking himself and delegating reconnaissance to other soldiers. But he still chose to lead a small group himself to expedite the process. Moreover, he shared pleasant news with the main heroine. After crossing a high mountain, they would reach a villa where everyone could enjoy some much-needed rest and a delicious dinner. Elvinora's offered to have dinner together once they arrived at their destination. The time had come to proceed, and of course the path remained quite arduous for the temple servant. Despite the extended journey on foot, she had failed to adapt and grow any more resilient. However, this time, as she attempted to ascend the mountain at a snail's pace, Captain Nycleve and his entire unit watched her from behind. For now, they were the ones trailing behind the group. She felt a sense of shame that she was impeding the others and forcing them to witness this pitiful spectacle. Even during the brief respite, she could barely remain on her feet, leaning against a tree to prevent herself from falling. Without a better solution, she proposed to Cavert that they allow the knights to move ahead, as Renee was significantly impeding their progress. At the very rear of the formation were a group of mercenaries consisting of just a few individuals. The healer could easily have joined them without inconveniencing anyone, for these individuals were also quite weary, and they would have been content if she kept pace with them. Besides, she was already acquainted with them. Unexpectedly, one of those very mercenaries was struck by an arrow, and the jovial youth who had been speaking with the priestess and his friends fell to the ground. Immediately, an enemy attack had begun, and no one could have foreseen an ambush on the group's well-scouted path. An arrow had flown perilously close and embedded itself in a tree next to Renee. The situation was undeniably harrowing for the temple servant, who had grown increasingly distraught. Unexpectedly, her vision was obscured by someone's hand, a gesture that appeared as a saving grace to her, for the main heroine wished to be spared from witnessing this horrific scene. Fortunately, even in this trying moment, the young lady was able to recognize the person whose palm was resting on her face. Cavert instructed the priestess to calm herself and to run in the direction he had indicated. Renesha sprinted away. She was so terror-stricken that she genuinely wanted to escape from that dreadful place. Not even hearing the clash of swords and battle cries, a person emerged to greet her. Thankfully, it was her friend Lily, who appeared rather agitated upon seeing her in such a distressing state. In fact, her friend was even inclined to heal the priestess, who seemed on the verge of losing consciousness. However, Renesha forbade her from doing so, for she did not wish other healers to expend their energies needlessly. By the time the main heroine finally regained her composure, she found herself surrounded by numerous paladins. She had once aided them, and now they were making every effort to assist her. As she contemplated these events, her tea had already grown cold in her hands, and Elvinora's appeared beside her. In the present moment, one of the Empire's two heroes stood before an unassuming young lady, genuflecting before her in a rather uncommon situation. Naturally, Renee was greatly surprised by the gentleman's comportment and surmised that it had to do with her injuries, which may be more serious than they initially appeared. Suddenly, he touched the healer's face and sought to reassure her. Undoubtedly, she had been terribly frightened during the unexpected attack. However, she was now safe. It was only now that she mustered the courage to recount how she had nearly perished from an arrow which had struck perilously close, and how she had been saved thanks to Cavert. All of a sudden, the Nyclave knights appeared alongside them. They had returned after the ambush, and almost all of them had survived. The first thing the healer did was run to their commander and express her gratitude for his rescue, even though he remained as aloof as ever. Naturally, there were a considerable number of wounded individuals following such a battle, yet only one mercenary had perished, the same one who had been struck by the arrow. Cavert was quite astonished that none of the temple priests had tended to the main heroine's wounds up to this point. She attempted to explain that she did not want to receive help that was far more needed by other wounded individuals. The Crimson Reaper then added Renee to the list of the injured along with everyone else. Lily was, of course, the one who would perform the healing, but the entire situation had overwhelmed Renee to the point where she felt a strong urge to cry. In the end, all of the wounded were saved, and the sole casualty of the ambush was the mercenary. Everyone was deeply saddened by the loss of their comrade, yet afterwards they discovered a modest wine cellar at the villa and decided to distract themselves from their sorrows with alcohol. However, even when evening fell and a sumptuous table was set with various dishes and the same wine, the main heroine remained melancholic. Lily couldn't fathom why her friend wasn't drinking at all, especially considering that in the past she had consumed a significantly greater quantity of alcoholic beverages in a short span of time. In truth, Renee had been absorbed in her thoughts throughout the entire evening, and the small celebration had done little to improve her mood. As a result, the healer decided to step away from the festivities for a brief stroll nearby. The stillness of the nocturnal forest provided some solace to the healer, and she hoped to finally dispel the troubling thoughts. However, it turned out that even there, she was not allowed to remain alone with her thoughts. The paladin captain appeared by her side, coming to admire the exquisite scenery and the moon alongside the temple servant, although she had initially retreated there for entirely different reasons. In any case, with this man's presence, the young woman came to realize that there was indeed a magnificent view all around. Only after some time, Elven Urs decided to break the silence and inquired if Renee's gloomy mood was due to the food that did not appeal to her taste. After receiving a negative response, the captain proceeded to list one reason after another, attempting to discern the true cause behind the healer's departure from the festivities and her desire for solitude in the woods. Suddenly, the temple priestess resolved to make a confession to someone who was seemingly a complete stranger to her. She revealed her wish to return to the temple as soon as possible, where she led a tranquil life. Of course, she had consciously joined the war and had no intention of simply fleeing like a coward. However, if she stayed in this place for too long, her psyche might seriously suffer. It was then that Elven Urs promised the main heroine that he would do everything within his power to expedite the conclusion of this military conflict, allowing all of them to return home and continue their regular lives. This gesture appeared exceedingly kind on his part, and cast him in the light of a knight who makes a vow to a lady, undoubtedly brightening the young woman's spirits. It was time for them to return to the celebration, as the following morning they would face another arduous climb up the mountain. Suddenly, Renee speculated that Elven Urs was comforting her and attempting to improve her mood solely to enhance her healing abilities. Naturally, this caused the radiant smile of the knight to dim. It seemed that she was correct. She could understand this, for she remembered how during a conversation in the tent, while it was not entirely pleasant, Renee could not condemn him for trying to assist her, even if he had his own reasons for doing so. However, Elven Oraz's countenance increasingly changed, and it appeared that the words of the main heroine were affecting him. Although he had deceived the young woman, his assistance and even his simple smile could not leave her indifferent to this situation. Renee applied a quote from a well-known figure, stating that people should be treated as an end, not as a means to an end. She added that one should not get angry, even if they are only seen as a means by another. The paladin commander pondered over these words, while the main heroine openly scrutinized his face, which undoubtedly stirred bewilderment. Renesha did not seal her admiration and complimented the beauty of one of the Empire's heroes. Then he employed her own words against her, since if the healer felt better by looking at his appearance, it meant she was using him as a means. Furthermore, Elvenuraz unexpectedly suggested that the temple servant address him by his first name, which only served to heighten her confusion. If you enjoyed today's content and want to stay updated on the latest and greatest in the world of anime and manhwa, don't forget to hit that subscribe button below.